The 2023 NFL season is officially over with, and now we get to take a step back and really evaluate the players, find out who killed us, what players did we draft way too high that didn't come through for us, and who saved us, what players were late round picks. Maybe they were somebody you grabbed off the waiver wire and they ended up being a mainstay on your roster and in your lineup all year long. We're going to talk about the top players in each category right now. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? There is no offseason here at the Fantasy Headliners. Whether you want NFL draft content, dynasty content, fantasy football content, general NFL knowledge, we're here all off season long. So make sure you stay subscribed and stick around and watch all the videos that we're going to be dropping during the off season to help you get ready for 2024. And one of the best ways that you can prepare for next season is really evaluating your process and maybe where you missed on some guys or you hit on some guys. And you know, Jake and I talk about hits and misses all the time. But in this video, I want to go over my top 10 players that either killed you or saved you this fantasy season, where they came from, did we miss something, and what happened with it. Hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new here, and make sure you turn on those bell notifications. Anytime we drop new content, you'll get that ping right to your phone. But for now, we're gonna hop right into it. And one of the biggest killers this year in fantasy football, unfortunately, was Austin Eckler. Austin Eckler was one of the top not only running backs drafted this season, but overall players, with an ADP of RB2 and number 5 overall in a majority of leagues. And unfortunately, he came nowhere close to that. To start the season, Austin Eckler looked great, almost 25 fantasy points in week 1. But that injury bug got him. He missed the next 3 games, and then with their bye week, he was able to return after, and unfortunately, back-to-back single-digit performances. But then everything looked fine, right? You looked at Austin Eckler, he was injured, and you thought maybe he just needed a couple of games to get going, and then over the course of the next 3 games, averaged 20 fantasy points through those 3 weeks. And we thought Austin Eckler is back. This is what we drafted him for. Everything is going to be fine the rest of the way. But then after week 10, he only managed to top 10 fantasy points twice. Maybe it was Austin Eckler. Maybe he was just losing a step and he's not going to be the same guy moving forward. Maybe it was the team, injuries, whatever it may have been. It was really just a combination of everything because yeah, he was banged up and it did look like maybe on the ground he wasn't as good as what we had gotten used to over the last couple of years. But LA dealt with a ton of injuries, especially at the wide receiver position, and they just were not healthy the entire season, especially without Justin Herbert to end the year. And fortunately enough, Brandon Staley is gone from LA. And now maybe we can get an offensive-minded coach in there that really knows how to utilize Justin Herbert and that offense, and Austin Eckler can get back to being a top 5 fantasy option next year. A lot is going to depend on if they bring anyone else in at the running back position and who they bring in to coach up the offense. To say Raheem Mostert saved your fantasy season would be a massive understatement. He was drafted as the RB37 outside the top 100 picks, but he ended up finishing the year as the RB2 and led the NFL with 18 rushing touchdowns. The next closest running back was Christian McCaffrey at 14 rushing touchdowns. Raheem Mostert had more total touchdowns in 2023 than he had had for his entire career combined leading up to that point. Now, the reason Raheem Mostert is getting a mention first here is because number 1, he did end up finishing higher than any other running back that you probably drafted in the later rounds. But number 2, consistency, because this guy put up points all year long. If you owned Raheem Mostert, you were throwing him in there, even when there was some uncertainty about whether or not Devon Achane was truly going to take a lot of fantasy points from him. Now, if there was a negative about Mostert, it was the fact that unfortunately he missed the final 2 weeks of the season. So for your fantasy championships, he wouldn't have been available. But probably for some of you out there, if you didn't have him, you never would have made it that far anyway. Mostert only had 3 weeks all season long where he finished finished with less than 10 fantasy points in half PPR leagues. The guy was exactly what you wanted. And even when he wasn't putting up a ton of rushing yards, he was still finding the end zone plenty in that potent offensive attack of the Miami Dolphins. Christian McCaffrey is arguably the fantasy MVP this season, but if you had to make a case for a second place finisher, Raheem Mostert would have a really strong case. He was either drafted very late or undrafted in a lot of fantasy leagues. And given the fact that he was consistent all year long, scoring fantasy points, and that he ended as the RB2, realistically, he would be the number 2 option right behind Christian McCaffrey if we were voting on fantasy MVPs. Raheem Mostert is on the wrong side of 30 though, and will this continue into next season? More than likely not. He probably won't be drafted very high. He might not even be with the Dolphins again next season at this point. He could end up calling it quits. We'll see what happens after this career year for him, but for now, we thank him for such a great season that saved a lot of us. This past offseason brought quite a few concerns when it came to running backs and their contracts, and Josh Jacobs fell into that category, first being franchise tagged and then signing a deal that barely paid him more than that franchise tag. A lot of people didn't really expect it coming and thought he may be holding out for multiple weeks. But Josh Jacobs was ready to go, and people still drafted him anyway. And potentially some of that rust showed to start the year, as Josh Jacobs was only a top 10 running back twice in the first 7 weeks of the season. But after a Week 8 loss to the Detroit Lions, Josh McDaniels was out and Antonio Pierce was in as the interim head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. And things were looking up, because over the course of the next 4 games, Josh Jacobs ran for over 100 yards 3 times. And Antonio Pierce even made the proclamation, if you look at the dominant teams from the 90s, like the Dallas Cowboys, they had Emmitt Smith and they had Michael Irvin, and they were utilizing those guys all the time. And coming out of that Week 13 bye, we really thought that Josh Jacobs was going to be huge for us down the stretch. But unfortunately, he gets injured against Minnesota right after the bye, and then he doesn't play another snap the rest of the season. Josh Jacobs, who was drafted as the RB8 and the 17th overall player, was only able to muster up an RB27 finish this season. And not only was he a guy that left us wondering what's going on during the regular season, but he wasn't even available for the fantasy playoffs. Man, I am really kicking myself for not mentioning this guy more prior to the 2023 season. Because prior to the 2022 season, I mentioned Kiron Williams a ton in off-season videos and in the regular season, and even had him listed as a pickup in the regular season to grab over Cam Akers, because I really thought Kiron Williams could steal that job away. He was hurt to begin the year in 2022, but we never heard a whole lot about him for the rest of the season. And I thought, you know what, if they were going to get rid of Cam Akers, they would have already done it. They're starting up the regular season with him. It seems like he's really going to be the guy. And sure enough, there was Kiron Williams to save the day. Kiron Williams was probably a waiver pickup for a majority of the people watching this video. Now, in some formats on some platforms that were much deeper leagues, he did end up popping up on the ADP data, being drafted as the RB40 and the 125th player overall, but ended up being the RB6 at the end of the season. And given the fact that he missed several games, I can't imagine what a full 17-game slate would have given him for fantasy points. After being injured in Week 6, Kiron Williams missed the next 4 weeks, and then he ended up sitting out 18 as well. But when you take a look at the overall numbers, he averaged just over 19 fantasy points per game. Compare that to the #1 overall player in fantasy this year, Christian McCaffrey. He averaged 22 fantasy points per game. Kiron Williams would have been right on the heels of Christian McCaffrey had he been healthy all year long. And again, because of where you drafted him at or where you picked him up at off the waiver wire, this was absolutely a guy that helped you win way more weeks than not. And not only was he putting up fantasy points, but he definitely showed that Sean McVay trusts him as the guy. Now, do they add somebody to kind of spell him a little bit in 2024? It's absolutely possible. But McVay loves Kiron Williams, and given the fact that he got so much workload this year, I could absolutely see him being a top 5 fantasy pick next year and one of the top 3 running backs taken in all formats. All right, let's move on to the wide receivers. And the first guy we're going to talk about, honestly, it's really not his fault. And that's Garrett Wilson from the Jets, because everybody was excited about the potential of this New York Jets team, this offense, and the players when Aaron Rodgers joined. And then like 3 minutes into the season, it all came crashing down. Garrett Wilson was drafted as the wide receiver 9, about 21 overall in most drafts, but only was able to finish as the wide receiver 31 on the season. And again, not his fault. The Jets, instead of deciding to go with a veteran quarterback, gave it a whirl with Zach Wilson, and that just did not work out. And then they tried to go back and forth between some other quarterbacks, eventually finishing the season with Zach Wilson, and honestly, it's all just a jumbled mess at this point. What we know moving forward is that Aaron Rodgers will likely be ready to go to start the 2024 season, and most people, even if they have a sour taste in their mouth from drafting Garrett Wilson so high this past year, in 2024, as long as Rodgers stays healthy, he should be okay. But the biggest news here is that the Jets have actually said they plan to sign a veteran quarterback to back up Rodgers next year, and Zach Wilson likely will be gone in a trade as well. So even if Rodgers is not able to stay healthy once again, hopefully they have somebody a little bit better to help take over and still make Garrett Wilson fantasy viable. How about this insane season from Nico Collins? Everyone to begin the year was really on the Tank Dell train, and hats off to Tank Dell because he gave you some really good performances. But he was really unable to stay healthy, which given his small frame was a concern coming into the season for a lot of analysts out there, especially draft analysts who covered his draft profile. Now, Nico Collins is a guy that we saw some glimpses of over the last couple of years. That big playability was there. The ability to go get touchdowns and work down the field. Was CJ Stroud going to be that guy though? Absolutely he was, and that helps Nico Collins break out in a huge way. Nico Collins was drafted 139th overall as the wide receiver 52, but ended up the season as the wide receiver 9. And when you needed him most, he was there, because heading into the fantasy playoffs and in the playoffs, he put together some pretty big performances. In week 12, he gave you 20 fantasy points. In week 13, he gave you 30 fantasy points. Unfortunately, in week 14, he got hurt, and he ended up missing weeks 15 as well. But then to finish up the fantasy season, scored 11, 12, and 30 fantasy points, respectively. And yes, there was some up and downs this season. There were some points where Nico Collins was only giving you single-digit games. He's definitely going to be a guy in the future who might be a little bit of a roller coaster ride, given the fact that he might be a little bit on the big play dependent side, especially if Tank Dell remains healthy. But that's okay, because when you take a look at Nico Collins, he could be on the same trajectory that we saw like a Tyler Lockett, where yes, if you draft him, there's going to be up and down weeks, but in the right matchups at the right time, he's going to win you weeks by himself. Now we got a couple of teammates that were on opposite ends of the spectrum. And when you see the first name up here, you'll probably know who the second name was. But Cooper Kupp was definitely one that ended up killing your season. Because in the preseason, when we found out that he was dealing with an injury and could end up missing time, people still continued to draft him at a pretty high clip. Cooper Kupp was the wide receiver 10 drafted this season, going at the end of the second round. So you were investing pretty heavily in a guy that was expected to miss some time. And that's exactly what happened. He ended up missing the first 4 weeks of the season. Now, when he came back in weeks 5 and 6, things seemed to look up. He was scoring fantasy points and he seemed to be back to himself. Then he put together 5 straight weeks, scoring less than 6 fantasy points. Now, Cooper Kupp may have redeemed himself a little bit, because in each of week 14 and 15, he scored over 20 fantasy points. So heading into the fantasy playoffs, he was definitely trying to help push your team over the edge and get you in there. But then he scored only 18 total fantasy points in week 16 and 17 before sitting out in week 18. So for Cooper Kupp as a second-round pick and maybe your wide receiver one, unfortunately, he just didn't get the job done this season. But for teammate Puka Ngata, he was absolutely a game changer for you this season, and he was largely undrafted in most any type of fantasy league that you look at outside of best ball. Now, it wasn't really brought up that Puka Ngata could make an impact on the Rams until it was found out that Cooper Kupp was dealing with an injury in the preseason. So a lot of people were not very familiar with Puka Ngata, and it led to him not being drafted in a majority of formats. And when Cooper Kupp was missing to begin the season, Ngata put up 2 games of 22 or more fantasy points and another game over 15 fantasy points. Fantasy owners were all over him at the beginning of the season, trying to get those waiver claims in, and a lot of people were also still skeptical. Could he end up keeping it up without Cooper Kupp there? Could he end up keeping up this pace when Cooper Kupp returned? And you had every right to be skeptical. But those of you that took the risk and invested your fab or your high waiver claims on him were rewarded for the rest of the season. Ngata had some gaudy numbers at times. Like Cooper Kupp, right there in the middle of the season, he did have some performances that were less than stellar. But total this year, Puka Ngata has to be one of the biggest fantasy breakouts that we've seen in quite some time. From undrafted and unknown to begin the season to being one of the most viable fantasy weapons that we could deploy week in and week out. The tight end position in 2023 was once again a roller coaster. We had some guys that just didn't quite get the job done. We had some guys that slipped under the radar to begin the season that were big contributors down the stretch for us. But when you take a look at the guys that absolutely killed us, I can't really say it's Travis Kelce. I know a lot of people are upset because they drafted him in the first or the second round, and he really didn't live up to those type of numbers, but he was still the tight end 3 on the season, so I can't give it to him. I'm gonna have to give it to Darren Waller instead. Darren Waller was being drafted as the tight end 5, 54th overall, and was only able to muster up the tight end 21 finish on the season. Now, missing a big chunk right in the middle of the year definitely hurt those numbers, but even before that, he really wasn't doing a whole lot. Over the first 8 weeks of the season, he had 5 games where he scored less than 7 fantasy points. And in 3 of those, he scored less than 4 fantasy points. Then he missed the next 5 games, but even when he came back at the end of the year, he never put together a performance where he scored more than 8 fantasy points. There was only 2 weeks this season where you started Darren Waller, where you got actual startable fantasy viable performances from him. He just did not live up to any type of expectation for when he was traded to the New York Giants. And maybe that has something to do with the offense. Daniel Jones ended up being hurt. They had backup quarterbacks in there this season, but even to begin the year, this offense was not functioning well, and Darren Waller was a huge misfire in that process. My vote for the tight end that saved you this year is going to be Trey McBride, and I know a lot of people are going to be voting for Matt LaPorta, and I absolutely get it, but Matt LaPorta was still being drafted in a majority of leagues. Trey McBride was undrafted this season and ended up finishing as the tight end 9. His numbers to begin the year were not that great, obviously, but he kicked it up and he was one of the best startable tight ends that we could put in our lineups for a majority of the year after that. And maybe this will help put things in perspective for you. His back half of the season was absolutely excellent. In fact, when you take a look at it, he was the tight end 32 through the first 7 weeks of the year. He was behind guys like Hayden Hurst, Noah Fant, Noah Gray, who wasn't even the top tight end on his own team, Mike Gesicki, Donald Parham, and others. But then from week 8 on, Trey McBride was the tight end 4. David Njoku, Sam LaPorta, and Evan Ingram were the only 3 tight ends to outscore Trey McBride from week 8 through week 18. So while I would love to give this one to Sam Laporta, I've got to pick Trey McBride. It's not very often that you're able to pick up a tight end off the waiver wire that gives you such great fantasy numbers throughout a majority of the season. And with how up and down the tight end position was, with injuries that we saw there and inconsistencies, if you decided to use a waiver wire on Trey McBride, he absolutely was well worth it. Headliner Nation, that is going to wrap it up. My top 10 players this year that either killed you or saved you. Let me know down in the comments below, who are some guys that you're voting for? Who's somebody that absolutely killed your team this year that you drafted? Who's somebody that maybe you drafted super late or picked up off the waivers that ended up saving your fantasy season? Is there anybody out there that you feel a vote should go to that wasn't included in this show? Let me know in the comments. But yo, appreciate everybody sticking around this entire offseason. I hope you all stay subscribed, but more importantly, I hope you all continue to watch the content all off season long. Turn on those bell notifications so anytime we drop content, you'll be notified that it's live and ready for your viewing pleasure. But for now, I'm gonna get out of here, Headliner Nation. Have a great day, stay safe and stay healthy. And I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.